Welcome to the Grounded in Peace podcast, where we explore what it means to cultivate peace within ourselves while working toward a more just and harmonious world. Join us as we uncover stories, practices, and ideas that inspire grounded collaborative action for lasting change.
Hello and welcome. Today I have with me Michelle Bemiller, who is a professor of sociology and criminal justice at Walsh University. We're going to be talking about restorative justice. Michelle is the director of the Center for Restorative Justice and Community Health at Walsh University. So she has a lot of experience and training and insights into what this thing is called restorative justice. So I'm looking forward to this conversation. Michelle, welcome.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Well, I think for many people, they just haven't heard of restorative justice. So let's just start by hearing, when you think about and practice restorative justice, what are we thinking about and practicing?
So restorative justice is a framework and a set of practices that really encourage individuals to think about building relationships in a positive way, and also oftentimes focuses on healing harms that may have happened in relationships. So a lot of the time when people hear about restorative justice, they think about restorative justice within the criminal justice system. And that's a fair space to begin because we have had a lot of restorative practices used within the criminal justice system. We can go back in history to First Persons tribes, indigenous peoples, and they were using restorative justice long before we white people colonized restorative justice, as is true for a lot of different things that we do in our society. But some people see restorative justice as, sort of an innovative way of encouraging people to be held accountable for their behavior. Howard Zehr, who is one of the founding fathers of restorative justice, would argue that it's not really innovative, it's the right thing to do. So we do restorative practices because we want to build community. We want to have spaces where people are held accountable if something problematic happens, whether it's in an interpersonal relationship or it's a crime that's been committed. We want to have opportunities to heal harms so that we can reintegrate people back into our communities to ensure that our communities are functional. So again, people look to criminal justice, they see restorative justice happening there, but it's grown beyond the criminal justice system. So it's actually happening in schools, it's happening in workplaces, and certainly is happening in our interpersonal relationships through the language that we use with one another.
Yeah, that's good, because I want to get to some of those larger, spheres of life that are outside of the criminal justice system, because from what I know about criminal justice, usually it is contrasted with retributive justice, which is a style that involves of criminal justice that involves punishment and this kind of thing, and is not victim focused. And so the language of victim and offender is used a lot. Can you talk us through? That might be worth going over as well, but it's interesting to me that there are all these different spheres of life. For those of us who don't have a lot of contact with the criminal justice system, restorative justice, probably has a role to play, as you say, in schools and families and businesses and stuff. So can you maybe choose one of those spheres of life and talk us through, and it could be the prisons too, or the criminal justice system, and but talk us through what restorative justice has to offer.
Sure. I'm going to switch gears from the justice system. We could certainly come back to that if you want to. But you're right. There are definitely counterparts within the justice system, with retributive justice kind of being the alternative to a restorative justice paradigm. Having said that, I think people need to think about restorative justice. As you said, a lot of us may not be involved in the justice system. So let's think about it in ways that could benefit us as individuals. So restorative justice and restorative practices really encourage us to build relationships with one another, to recognize one another's humanity, to learn how to empathize with one another. So in sociology, we talk about taking the role of the other, putting ourselves in someone else's shoes, and really trying to understand where are people coming from. Restorative justice is very much in line with that kind of thought process. If you were to participate in reading about restorative justice or did any kind of training in restorative justice, you would learn a lot of language that falls in line with restorative practices. And empathy is one of those big words that align with restorative practices and restorative justice. Conflict resolution is certainly something that we talk about. Communication and how important communication is with one another. So we can be talking about these things in small group environments, but we can also be talking about them interpersonally within our own relationships with our partners, with our friends, family members. How do we talk to each other? How do we hold ourselves accountable for the things we say that may be hurtful, that may cause harm, and vice versa? Within school systems, restorative justice has become used as an alternative to traditional discipline.
And I was going to say, so this has to do with the discipline side of things and how discipline has happened. I mean, it seems to me that all of these spheres of life are really instructive, I suppose, with just to sometimes make reference again to prisons and stuff. I mean, where you can lock someone away and then kind of pretend that that's solved the problem, and then we have issues with people reoffending and so forth, where there hasn't been, attention or enough attention given to how they're being rehabilitated, or if they are at all. But in these other spheres of life, we're going to be, like in a school, these kids are going to be around, and maybe they'll be at school the next day, or, depending on how that discipline is handled. So, I mean, it seems to me really appropriate to think about ways that we can, address discipline and conflict in ways that preserve the relationship that we're probably going to continue to have with each other anyway. Yeah, I mean, I just want to say that. So tell me about what this looks like in schools. I mean, I'm picturing a traditional kind of discipline model as I've observed, and maybe a suspension is made, or there's a way of, taking a kid who's disruptive or even violent. And I think we all kind of have a picture of what the traditional way of discipline looks like. So what might a restorative approach look like in a school?
It can look like a lot of different things, and oftentimes it's going to be dependent on the comfort level of the school, as well as the background of the individuals in the schools with restorative practices. Some schools who have really gone into restorative practices in a big way, using a whole school approach, have individuals that they have hired that are actually working through the school system, or they have counselors, for example, who are using these practices with students. Let's just use the example, a student is suspended. Okay, it's a zero tolerance policy, something like an assault in the school. They may use a punitive form of discipline and suspend that student for 10 days or, whatever they've determined is necessary. Having done that, it doesn't necessarily mean that that student is being held accountable to the degree that we may like. They can go home. They can hang out at home for 10 days, but when they come back, it's often times that we see that behavior repeat itself because there's an unresolved issue there. And that's really what restorative justice and restorative practices are going to want to dig into. What is that unresolved issue? Where is this coming from in the first place? And so it could be something as simple as a restorative dialogue or restorative conversation that's happening between maybe a counselor, maybe a principal, and that student to try to determine what's happening here. What are the needs of this individual that are not being met that lead to this infraction continuing or escalating even? So asking questions like, from your perspective, what happened? Why did this occur?
And would those questions or a different set of questions be asked of the victim? Maybe that's not the best language to use, but I'm still thinking of victim and offender because that language of addressing the needs of the victim is so often used. How does that play out in a school setting?
So if you're doing a restorative dialogue, I would see it, it could happen in a few different ways. If you're doing a dialogue and it's a one-on-one dialogue, it would start with, let's say, the counselor and the student who had offended or harmed someone. If they harm someone, it could be an individual, it could be a group, it could be the whole community of the school. depending on what the transgression was. Talking to them about what happened, what got them to where they are, trying to figure out what are those needs. But absolutely, we also want to bring in the harmed party or harmed parties and have individual conversations with them, getting their perspective about what happened, what are their needs given what happened. It could be the case then that we move into a more formalized restorative process where we're able to get into what's called a restorative circle and have a really in-depth conversation between the involved parties to try to determine what do we do from this point forward. So somebody has wronged someone else or multiple somebodies. There's often pain and discomfort in that relationship. So we want to try to heal that harm to the best degree possible through having a conversation in circle that, again, reiterates those questions of, from your perspectives, what happened, what do we need to do?
So everyone's heard, everyone's listened to, they're sharing their perspective on how they were affected. But someone's running that, someone is
absolutely
moving the process along.
Yes, you have a trained circle keeper, which is the term for the facilitator in the circle, who is working through that circle. And we need to keep in mind that we're not just jumping into this space. There's been some pre-work done. Those restorative conversations that I was talking about, there would be a number of those to determine if it's acceptable to get these individuals into this space, to make sure it's a safe space. It can be a productive, healing space. So once we get into the conversation and the facilitator is asking numerous questions to try to get each of the individuals to understand where the other's coming from, there does have to be some level of accountability and an agreement about how we can heal that harm and move forward to the best degree possible. Doesn't mean forgiveness is going to happen, and that's okay.
Yeah. I mean, I think for some people who hear about restorative justice, and maybe this is mostly in the criminal justice side of things, it seems soft, to them.
Sure.
Or soft, I mean, I don't see people resisting hearing from victims and, taking into account their needs. But it seems easy for a lot of folks to just write off the offender, in those scenarios. Do you have thoughts on that? I mean, is it...
To write off the offender in terms of its...
Well, sorry. Yeah, so... not to really care about the needs there. I mean, you're saying, it's really important to recognize the needs that were not being met or, whatever led to this. But I mean, I can imagine, and I don't have to imagine, styles of discipline that don't ask those questions.
Sure.
And that seems more, that probably strikes a lot of people as better, it's because it's tougher. It's tougher on crime and tougher on. So, I mean, do you have thoughts on that kind of objection? It seems soft.
I do. I always use an analogy, trying to get people to think about their own lives and where maybe they might have been sort of pushed in the direction of a restorative process versus a punitive process. And I always think about my sibling. And, if we would get in trouble, first thing that would happen would be we would be separated, right? We'd go to our rooms. And that was the best case scenario because we did not want to sit down face to face in a room and have to talk to each other and apologize for what had happened. Now, that's definitely a low-level example, but I do think it resonates with people in the sense that they do think if somebody did something wrong, if you harm somebody, then you should be, depending on the level of harm, maybe removed from society. And, depending on the level of harm, maybe that's true. We don't argue that restorative justice can be used in every situation. There are certainly circumstances where it may not be a good fit. Having said that, if we can use it, it's very beneficial for people who have been harmed as well as the people who are doing the harm. And the reason I say that, and the literature says that, is because oftentimes people who harm have been harmed themselves.
Right.
And so it's a cycle of harm that's happening. And it's going to keep happening until we take the time to sit down and have a conversation with these individuals and try to get at the heart of what's happening.
To break the cycle, to intervene. I mean, from what you're saying, it takes a lot more time and a lot more effort, and it's it's got to be quite uncomfortable, I mean, because we're having to face the conflict or face talk through something that it's easier not to talk through. How do we, I mean, do you see schools receptive to the additional effort that it takes?
I would say to some degree, yes. I think with schools it's challenging because we do have so many expectations that we put on counselors and teachers and other staff members, and we only have so much time within a school day. So it can be tricky to determine how to make that happen, how to be successful using these practices. But I think if you find the space that a lot of schools are on board with trying to do something like this, they see the relevance of it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's wonderful. And you mentioned empathy before, and maybe I can get you to say more about the kinds of, well, I guess I can imagine restorative justice being understood as a set of procedures or principles, but I want to ask you about the kinds of preparatory work that a person who's interested in restorative justice should undergo themselves. I mean, so that we're not just reacting. In other words, we're waiting for something bad to happen, but you've already mentioned empathy, and so I mean, talk us through what the values of restorative justice are that a person can work on fostering within themselves and within their circles.
Sure. So I think if somebody wants to be a restorative person, obviously empathy is a big component of that. So having that capability or willingness to be open to other perspectives, to hear what other people have to say, even if at your heart you feel that you wholeheartedly disagree with that individual. Listening is a big step in the right direction of demonstrating I recognize that we are both human beings. We both have dignity. We both have rights. Let's try to, if we can't get on the same page, at least be willing to hear what the other person has to say. Yeah. And oftentimes that goes a long way in terms of opening up lines of communication and building space where we can learn and we can grow from one another. So that's at a very basic level of restorative justice, where we're starting to build community. We're starting to hear one another and care about one another.
Well, it seems to me that level of listening may not be something we're really used to. I think about how hard it is for me to listen to someone I disagree with, because I want so badly to either say, "Oh yeah, I see, I agree," it's kind of nod along, or just not to listen. But I mean, you're talking about a third thing, which is listen without judgment, or at least without shutting it down.
Sure.
Do you have tips on how that can happen interpersonally? I mean, that it probably takes a big heart, but it probably takes some skill too.
I think it does take a big heart, but it also takes practice. I mean, there are some practical components to that. It does take, the ability to be very self-aware of who you are. So a lot of times when I train people, I talk about emotional intelligence, and we do some inventories. Where are we at in terms of our emotional intelligence? What do we know about ourselves? What do we see in other people? Yeah. How do we learn how to use self-control? And that's part of what participating in restorative circles is about too. You have a talking piece. You talk when you have the talking piece. So it really helps to control that space in a way that allows people to have a voice and to not be talked over. That's what tends to happen a lot when we're trying to hear one another, is we all want to be heard, and we keep running over each other as we're talking. And that just ends up being kind of a recipe for disaster. So breathing, pausing, taking a pause to just hear what somebody has to say, not jumping in constantly and feeling like you always have to have something to say. Sometimes just listening for quite a while is enough. And then you may have your opportunity to engage and say, I really appreciate what you said. I appreciate hearing your perspective. I see things a little bit differently. And so it's all about how you approach that conversation as well. Yeah. And some people are just not ready to have conversations about some things, and that's okay too.
I could see that. And the times I've been part of circles, there's the talking piece, and maybe this is standard for circles, but there's a centerpiece.
Mm-hmm.
So I was part of a circle, then it was being led by someone who's really skilled at it, and it was an empty bag in the center of the circle, and and we were encouraged to focus on it, and maybe if it got awkward to, if you were looking at the person, so you're looking at this empty bag, and but it was open, and it kind of represented the openness that we're bringing to the circle and to each other, and I thought that was wonderful. It really helped me. Like, this is why I'm here. I'm open. I don't have to constantly find myself closing or tell myself I need to close in on something. I'm just open to what I'm hearing. And I knew that others would be open to what I was saying when it was my turn to talk. That's really a neat
I love
thing.
that. That's a great idea.
Are these, have you worked with people of different age groups in your restorative trainings and practices?
Yes. So I have run some programs with students in K through 12 environments. I have also mostly participated with faculty and staff at universities where we have done workshops and trainings, have facilitated circles in those spaces.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit different, depending on what group you're working with.
What are some of the challenges working with kids?
Attention span is a big one with kids, depending on the age group, certainly. Discomfort, but I would say that also spans into the adults that you work with, because there is a vulnerability that happens. And if you're a 12-year-old kid, being vulnerable is especially uncomfortable around your peers. And so you do have to be careful about how you start them off in circle and get gradually more sophisticated.
I was wondering, we may not want to just jump right in. Are there, it seems like we want to build cultures of restoration.
Yes.
Right? What are some of the shallow end of the pool kinds of things? We've been talking about circles, but are there other kinds of things that kind of can prepare a person for, the level of openness that we're hoping to achieve?
Sure. If we're talking about kids, again, a lot of times we'll do activities with the students prior to getting them into a circle. So they will do, for example, a self-exploration collage where they create, they cut pictures out, they put stickers, anything that represents who they are. They may fill out worksheets talking about what friendship means, how they develop friendships, kind of softball topics that we can then transition into a circle process. Yeah. And the circle process is really essential, I think, for that age group. And the younger, the better. If they're doing it throughout their time in school, I think that's going to make a huge impact on the school culture and also the students themselves. But the circle is really instrumental in helping them build some soft skills, not just empathy, but learning turn-taking, learning self-regulation, learning how to listen to other people.
Yeah. And then after a circle, and maybe there's multiple circles and people have shared, and there's been lots of perspectives shared about how they've, how this has affected them. What are some of the follow-up steps that the facilitator leads the group through or the individuals through once?
Sure.
Because I can't imagine that this circle itself, there's probably a lot of healing that happens in the circle, but are there specific outcomes that probably, that can be kind of taken from there and then moved along?
Sure. So if it's kind of a low-level circle, which I would qualify as a community building circle, we would start with something like that with young kids. That's really just an opportunity to get to know each other. You ask questions about, what's your favorite food? What's your favorite book? Just kind of trying to build community, getting them to connect with each other and see, oh, wow, we have some things in common. That's interesting. And at the end of that type of circle, you just kind of do a takeaway round. What did you learn about somebody in the circle that you didn't already know? But if you're escalating to a higher level circle where you are trying to heal harm that has happened, you do at the end of the circle want to come up with some kind of an agreement. And so you're working together as a team to determine what is that agreement going to look like. So if somebody harms someone in the circle, what does the harmed person want to see happen? And keep in mind, we've had lots of conversations leading up to this. So we all kind of have an idea of what that person is going to want, and we make sure that it's feasible. So they can throw out some ideas. The person who did the harm can then say, I'm comfortable apologizing, or I'm comfortable doing some kind of community service. I agree, I wronged you. They may apologize.
Yeah.
In that moment, they may not. But we do put together a formal agreement that's typed up and signed off on, and then there are follow-ups to that particular circle. Maybe another circle where we come together and we regroup and ask how things have gone, if they have followed through. It could be just a restorative conversation between the facilitator and that individual with some communication back to the person who was harmed. So there are lots of different ways that you can navigate circles depending on the voluntary nature of the circle. So that just means if the person, all people are willing to come to the table. If not, there are still other things that you can do with circle practices to help the parties, even if everybody's not in that space. So you can get creative. You can get creative with the structure of restorative practices and also with the mechanisms that are used to hold individuals accountable.
I'm picturing, I can imagine there being two paths, maybe the more traditional discipline path that remains. I mean, it's an option. It's probably not going to go away. And especially if the parties involved don't, agree to the restorative path. I mean, have you been in settings where the restorative path just isn't chosen, or it's not working, or, I mean, I maybe you can talk through what some of the roadblocks might be. But, I mean, what are the options outside of the restorative path
Sure.
if it just doesn't happen?
And it may not. I mean, you may be doing what we call pre-circle interviews where you're talking to the person that was harmed, the person who did the harm. And one of those parties either says they don't want to participate in this type of process, or through the questions that you're asking, red flags come up, letting you know that if you get into that process, there are going to be some serious issues that are not easily managed within that space and could be harmful. So you really want to be careful about who you're putting in a circle together. It may mean that you just have to do more work on the back end before you get into the circle, or it may mean that it's just not going to happen.
Yeah.
And that's okay. Because sometimes, months, years down the road, it may happen. In the meantime, it could be the case that a traditional disciplinary structure is put into place because something has to happen. The school has to act. The justice system has to act in some way. And if individuals are not on board to do the restorative process, it has to be voluntary. Now, there are some situations where I would say the processes are done kind of as a carrot and a stick kind of thing, that there's a little bit of push to say, you may want to do this, otherwise this is going to happen, and that's going to be worse for you than if you sit in the circle. I would say that's still not the best kind of...
Because there's an element of coercion
Exactly.
there. Yeah. Good cop, bad cop.
Right. And so it's still not going to be as successful as one where both parties come in saying, yep, I want to do this. The person who did harm says, I really did mess up. I want to be held accountable for this. And the person that was harmed says, I could really use some closure. Yeah. So I'm willing to do this. Again, it's going to depend on the structure of the system, all the players who are involved, because sometimes we are being held accountable by a higher level institution. And so they may have a certain idea of what's going to happen and say, yeah, you can do the restorative process. But at the end of the day, we're still going to have this punitive mechanism in place as well.
Yeah. And you're not discouraged by, the reality that it's not going to work in every case. I mean, you're not deterred by that. I mean, probably nothing in life is 100% anyway. But is it... like, what keeps you enthusiastic about restorative justice? Is it seeing when it works and how well it works? Is there an element of hope that is carrying you forward?
I would say it's a number of things. I do think hope carries me forward. I do see the good in people and do believe that if it didn't work this time, it will the next. And I am also a realist in understanding that, no process is perfect. It's not going to work all the time for every person. But one of the things that I think really keeps me going is that proactive element that is a part of restorative justice. So the opportunity to do things like community building circles with young people and to get them to see each other as human beings, which then the hope is, and research has shown, makes it less likely that they're going to do horrible things to one another if they relate.
We could learn from, because we're talking about school settings, but in families, a standard form of discipline with kids in families is the timeout, and that mimics a lot of how we handle disobedience. But it's not necessarily restorative. It can be part of a restorative process, I imagine. Do you have thoughts? I mean, I'm a parent. You're a parent. Do you have thoughts on what this looks like in a family?
I have never had to use a timeout with my daughter, and I just think that's because I got lucky.
Good for you.
But we have always had very open conversations. I respect her, and she respects me. I think sometimes that becomes challenging for parents who do feel like we have to maintain some level of control, and that's true. But respect is really at the heart of all relationships. Your idea of timeout, some parents may think, well, I'm not going to stop doing timeout. That makes me really uncomfortable. Well, you could do timeout, and they can be there for a bit, but you can also sit in timeout with the kids and say, let's have a conversation about what happened and why what you did was harmful.
I've heard that called time in.
I like that.
But I mean, that takes more effort, right?
It does.
But
it
I
takes
was thinking,
work.
You're not, hopefully most parents don't have a hard time seeing their kids as human beings. I mean, and so that might be, for all the challenges that kind of family life throws up. At least that element is, one way or another, you're probably going to continue living with your, these members of your family. And so we can't totally write off the kids or just imagine that they're less than human and not worthy of respect. I mean, I get it. That sometimes does happen in families, but where those things are in place, it seems like much more, an easier way into thinking in terms of restorative practice. We can kind of say, oh, here's a human being who lives in my house, who I love, right. And so...
but they also drive us crazy.
Yeah.
And we drive them crazy, and that's okay.
So the timeout can serve that kind of purpose. It'd be good for the parent, too, to kind of be away from it. But I guess I was thinking the circle... circle, I picture several people in a circle, and maybe this is, two people, right? A parent and a child. Right. What does that look like in that kind of two-person setting?
It's more a conversation. I think, you could certainly use a talking piece. If you're comfortable doing that in your family, I could see kids being, if it's a one-on-one kind of thing, being like, oh, this is goofy. I don't feel comfortable doing this. The circle itself lends itself much more to using the appropriate, the centerpiece, the talking piece. I just see restorative practices and restorative justice, that foundation, that framework in a home being more about how do we talk to each other? How do we use the restorative language?
How do we listen?
Yes. And also, how do we give ourselves some grace in recognizing that we're going to screw up as human beings? And that's true even outside of the family. But how do we pull that back in? How do we hold ourselves accountable for that mess up? Because we're all going to mess up. Yeah. So you blow up at your kid. You're right. Maybe it's better that, you have a big fight. You take a time out. Everybody takes a time out. It's okay the next day to walk into the room and say, you know what? I really want to talk about what happened yesterday. I was upset. You were upset. Can we have a conversation about that? And if it seems like we're going to blow up again, okay, maybe we still need a little bit of time, but I want to get there. I want us to talk about what happened and how we can try to see that it doesn't happen again if that's possible.
It's okay for a parent to apologize
Absolutely.
to their child. I've done plenty of that. It seems to me that's good modeling, that sometimes that it's okay to say, I'm sorry, and to ask for forgiveness. And then, because they'll be in that position sometime.
Absolutely.
And it's nice to know that that's an option. Yeah. Well, this has been a really neat conversation. Can I just ask that maybe as a final question, how want to say hopeful. We just talked about hope. But, well, how hopeful are you that the kinds of things we're talking about will, I guess, kind of slowly, but over time, influence some of the big structures like schools, like prisons? I mean, we've talked a lot about interpersonal things too, but other countries are probably further ahead on this than we are. I know that they are. Where are you at with as you look toward the future?
I'm cautiously optimistic, I would say. I do have hope, and the reason that I have hope is because I do think on an interpersonal level, there are many of us, regardless of where we're at in terms of our religious backgrounds, our political backgrounds, who do recognize the importance of having conversations with one another, of trying to understand where people are coming from. And I say that on an interpersonal grassroots level. And that's really where peace building and restorative justice begin, is at that grassroots level. And if we can keep making even incremental shifts, little small inches forward, that's progress. And the fact that we have some schools that are interested in exploring restorative justice and its practices as an option, that's hopeful, and that can grow. It plants seeds. You teach kids in school, they teach their parents. Their parents teach their friends. So I am optimistic.